The world that Adolf Hitler saw in 1939 was not the world that actually existed. Inside his own mind, shaped by the trauma of the First World War, the collapse of the German Empire, and the humiliation of Versailles, he believed the history was offering him a final chance to rebuild everything Germany had lost. Every decision he made from that moment onward came from a worldview forged not in logic, but in ideology, a worldview where nations were living organisms. Races were locked in eternal struggle, and conflict was not tragedy but necessity. As Europe drifted toward war, Hitler did not see diplomacy failing. He saw destiny unfolding. When he invaded Poland in September 1939, Hitler believed he was correcting the map of Europe, not destroying it. He expected the Western powers to protest loudly but act slowly. He assumed Britain and France were unwilling to fight, just as they had been in the Rhineland, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. In his mind, the war that began in 1939 was simply the final chapter of a long process he had started. Years earlier, a process designed to secure German space, unify German blood, and eliminate any threat that remained on the continent. The Blitzkrieg in Poland was more than a military victory. It was a confirmation, a validation of everything he believed about himself, his army, and the enemies he despised. What he saw through his own narrow lens was not a Europe preparing for total war, but a continent collapsing like rotted wood. Each success pushed him deeper into the idea that he alone possessed the instinct of a great conqueror. His generals, many of whom viewed the invasion with anxiety and caution, suddenly found themselves overshadowed by a leader who believed his intuition was superior to their experience. And as winter settled over Europe in 1939, Hitler felt certain that the true shaping of his empire had only just begun. By the spring of 1940, that belief had hardened into something dangerous overconfidence. Hitler saw the Scandinavian campaign not as a complex risk, but as an opportunity to outmaneuver Britain. When Denmark surrendered in hours and Norway fell despite Allied intervention, he interpreted it as destiny confirming his path. And as the German attack surged into the Low Countries in May 1940, Hitler watched the collapse of Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Belgium as if he were watching a script that had been written long ago. But nothing shaped his perspective more than France. The idea that the world's most respected army could be broken in 6 weeks, that tanks and aircraft could achieve what Germany had failed to do over 4 bloody years in the First World War, pushed Hitler into a new mental universe. In that universe, he was no longer the gambler. He was the architect, the man who had discovered the formula to unlock Europe. And when he stood in Paris in June 1940, staring at the Arc de Triomphe, he believed he was witnessing the rebirth of German greatness through his own vision. It was also in 1940 that Hitler's misunderstanding of Britain became painfully clear, though he refused to acknowledge it. In his mind, the British were members of a kindred race, an empire that would eventually accept Germany's dominance of the continent. He believed they would negotiate once France fell. He believed their resolve would crumble once they were isolated. He believed the RAF was merely delaying the inevitable. But the British refusal to surrender, their decision to resist, even after standing alone, made no sense inside Hitler's worldview. Instead of reassessing his assumptions, he concluded that Britain was simply being irrational. Influenced by a stubborn leader, he misread completely Winston Churchill, and so what Hitler saw after the Battle of Britain was not a failed strategic campaign. He saw an unnecessary holdout, a temporary barrier that would crumble once Germany turned east. The invasion of the Soviet Union was not a sudden shift, not a desperate measure, not a reaction to strategic failure. In Hitler's perspective, it was the true purpose of the war, a war to conquer land, to eliminate Bolshevism, and to secure the resources Germany needed to stand as the world's dominant power. Every assumption that guided Operation Bar came from Hitler's worldview, not from intelligence reports, not from logistical studies, not from military analysis. He believed the Soviet Union was a political construction destined to collapse. He believed Slavic populations could not fight a long war. He believed the Red Army was poorly led, poorly trained, and incapable of coordinated defense. And he believed victory would come so swiftly that the campaign would be effectively decided before winter. For him, the invasion was not a risk. It was inevitability. And because his perspective had been reinforced by 2 years of rapid success, his confidence drowned out every warning his generals attempted to raise. What he did not see, what he refused to see, was the vastness of the Soviet landscape, the resilience of the Red Army, the industrial depth beyond the Euro, and the power of ideology in mobilizing millions. Instead, he saw only the surface, disorganized retreats, rapid encyclamatias, shattered divisions. In the summer of 1941, he believed his vision had been proven again. In the fall of 1941, he believed victory was days away. Even when winter arrived, freezing equipment, halting tanks, and paralyzing supply lines, Hitler did not see a strategic failure. He saw treachery, incompetence, and inconvenience, problems to be overcome by willpower alone. And then came the United States. Long before Pearl Harbor, Hitler thought he understood America a nation of consumers, not warriors. A country with no historic memory of suffering, no thirst for territorial expansion, and no political unity. He believed American aid to Britain was symbolic. He believed Roosevelt was bluffing. He believed American industry would take years to mobilize. So when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and Hitler declared war on the United States, he believed he was entering a war against a giant with soft bones. But in reality, he had awakened a nation with industrial power greater than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. Adolf Hitler did not realize it at that moment, but by declaring war on the United States while already fighting Britain and the Soviet Union, he had crossed a line from which no victory was possible. Yet still, inside his own mind, nothing had changed. He believed history favored the brave. He believed destiny rewarded resolve. He believed every setback was temporary. Every delay was sabotaged. Every defeat was the fault of someone else. By late 1941, as the Eastern Front froze and the global balance shifted, Hitler's perspective stopped evolving. It became rigid, impermeable, unchanging. While the Allies adapted, restructured, and learned, Hitler saw the war as a test of will, a test that only he could endure. And as the years moved forward, the gap between the war Hitler believed he was fighting and the war Germany was actually losing only continued to grow. This gap, this fracture between ideology and reality, is the core through which all the next stages of the war must be understood, because to truly see World War II from Hitler's perspective, we must understand the lenses he used to interpret everything: the military decisions, the moral justifications, the disasters, and the final collapse. Each lens shaped not only his actions, but the fate of tens of millions. And now, with the world built inside his mind fully formed, the next chapter begins, the angles that reveal how Hitler interpreted the war on every front, in every crisis, through every belief that drove him toward the edge of ruin. To him, Versailles was not merely unfair, it was an act of deliberate strangulation. He came to see the Weimar governments as weak, traitorous caretakers of a Germany forced into submissive compliance. Years before 1939, long before the armies were rebuilt and the factories reopened, he had already decided that another war was inevitable. And, in his mind, Germany would not simply survive that war, it would reshape Europe entirely. But Hitler's perspective was not formed in isolation. The global economic collapse of 1929 had crippled nations across the world. Unemployment soared, governments toppled, democracies faltered. As chaos spread, political extremes gained traction. In Germany, where millions lost jobs, homes, and savings, the longing for stability became desperation. Hitler interpreted this collapse as proof that liberal democracy was weak, indecisive, and doomed to fail. He believed only authoritarian control and ideological purity could prevent national decay. By 1933, when he rose to power, he saw himself not as a revolutionary seizing opportunity, but as a leader chosen to restore Germany's rightful place. His worldview divided humanity into hierarchies, a rigid structure of worth, race, and destiny. At the top stood what he defined as the Aryan race. Below were groups he labeled as inferior or threatening. This racial ideology was not a side belief. It was the engine of every major decision he made. Expansion, war, persecution, all of it rested on the assumption that history itself favored his version of racial struggle. Hitler viewed nations not as political entities, but as living organisms locked in eternal competition. To him, peace was an illusion. Survival depended on strength. Prosperity required expansion, and conquest was not immoral but natural. This belief shaped his obsession with Lebensraum space, which he insisted Germany needed to secure its future. He saw Eastern Europe as both a resource and a battleground, a place where Germany's destiny would be won through force.